to Homeland Security. The first thing is to recognize Homeland Security is a, quote, concerted national effort to prevent terrorist attacks within the United States, reduce America's vulnerability to terrorism, and minimize the damage and recover from attacks that do occur, right? So this is a very, very holistic account. And as we can see in this initial strategic approach is that we can differentiate the parts. The first part is the concerted national effort to prevent, right? The first phase is prevention, right? We want to be able to make sure, and obviously this is within the context of terrorism. So if you want to say phases of the approach, to be technical, again, this information is coming from the Department of Homeland Security.gov page, right? If you want to talk about phases, and this is sort of my vernacular, not their vernacular, we can look at prevention as a phase, right? We want to make sure that terrorism is prevented, and later as we progress we'll talk about various methods in which the Department of Homeland Security, in concert with many subsidiary organizations, go about implementing effective preventative mechanisms to reduce the likelihood of terrorist attacks. And I'll talk later about many different strategic, both practical and theoretical approaches to maximizing preventative strategies. So, concerted national effort is effort to prevent terrorist attack within the United States, reduce America's vulnerability to terrorism, right? So the first phase is prevention. The next thing that we can talk about is reduction, right? And we want to, according to the Department of Homeland Security.gov page, I'll read that section again, reduce America's vulnerability to terrorism, right? The various mechanisms in which we can reduce our vulnerability to terrorism. There's many different methods. I'll give you one just really quick, super general method, because this will probably be the most familiar and easily recognizable method of reducing terrorist attacks in the United States of America. It was the case, I live in Florida, I think it was a church maybe last year in like Gainesville or Ocala that was considering burning the Quran in some protest. I forget the nature of the debate. But a church leader said he was going to burn the Quran. This really got individuals within his church and himself, it put them in serious danger, but not only them in danger, it really put our troops abroad in danger, right? Because it's not so much that the particular pastor and his congregation were threatening to burn the Quran, it was viewed internationally, or it could be viewed internationally, that the United States of America, as a governing body, endorsed this. And of course, all of the proper bureaucrats came out and condemned this attempt, right? We can reduce terrorist attacks, the attempt to renounce this particular pastor's belief that he was going to burn it and his justification for burning the Quran, right? This is an attempt to reduce the terror threat, right? Obviously, the threat of an attack is going to be heightened if it is viewed that we are willfully and purposefully aggravating the threat, right? If we're intentionally debasing whatever the religious view is, and I don't want to just situate this within Islamic terrorism. The first thing that I want to make sure that I'm very clear of, when I'm talking about terrorism, I'm just talking about terrorism in an abstract sense. I am not talking about terrorism in terms of specifically any instantiation of a terrorist organization. I'm not talking about Al-Qaeda. I'm not talking about Islamic fundamentalism. And I wouldn't even say that I'm making distinctions between international versus domestic terrorism. If I need to make those distinctions, I will make those distinctions. But when I'm speaking generally of terrorism, I'm just talking about terrorism in general. Again, I've already done a 50-plus part series on international war and sort of terrorism analysis. So if you want to refer to my videos on terrorism that I already have and sort of the various demarcations in terrorist organizations and concepts, please refer to that. With respect to my analysis here, reduction, the example that I was giving you is, that's a form of reduction, right? Making sure that we attempt to reduce any aggravations that might build, rather than exacerbating, we want to diminish the threat. So that's the second form. The next and the last form, right, is and minimize the damage and recover from attacks that do occur. Right? So we're going to look at recovery. So we have prevention, reduction, and recovery, right? Obviously, recovery of all the three phases, if you will, to this approach, the Department of Homeland Security, in this strategic approach, we want to make sure that this is, we need to have policies, mechanisms in place for recovery, but obviously recovery assumes that there has already been an attack. And this is where emergency management systems come in, and I'll talk in a second about the various forms and so on, right? So we understand what recovery is. So prevention, again, we want to make sure that it doesn't occur to begin with. If the threat is escalating and we can see that there's an escalation in this conflict, we want to attempt to reduce or de-escalate the conflict. And if we fail in reducing or de-escalating the conflict, once the attack occurs, we want to be able to effectively minimize the scope of the attack, minimize the amount of death, the casualty rate, and also be able to recover from whatever the attack might be, whatever form the attack might take. So again, the various approaches those are the three strategic approaches to Homeland Security, and it's very important that you recognize that distinction. It's the case, however, in a discussion of national security and Homeland Security that practitioners, theoretical practitioners such as myself, analysts, people who work for the government, the Department of Defense, CIA, FBI, EMT and emergency personnel, if you look at sheriff's departments and chiefs of police, there are disagreements in the field between practitioners about how we can make sense of addressing the strategic approach from the Department of Homeland Security. So one is going to be more specific, one is going to be less specific. I would say that neither are false, it's more of an approach. I'm going to give you, and actually this is discussed on the first and second page of the book. So these are practitioner disagreements, right? These are disagreements that practitioners might have. And obviously when we're talking about practitioners of national security, Homeland Security, and so on. Okay. Practitioner disagreements. So the first is terrorist focus. The first is a terrorist focus. And here's a quote from Alperin. Quote, "They believe that focusing on any..." Hold on a second. Oopsie. Okay, I get that. Terrorist focus, right? Quote, "They believe that focusing on anything additional dilutes, distracts, and weakens the mission." They being practitioners, right? They, practitioners, believe that focusing on anything additional dilutes, distracts, and weakens the mission. Obviously, I've already stated what the mission of Homeland Security was. I've talked about the strategic approaches, right? First phase, we want to make sure that we prevent. Second phase, we want to make sure that we reduce. Last phase, we want to make sure that we recover. Individuals who ascribe to a terrorist focus say that all of our focus should be targeted towards terrorism and terrorist activity. So that's the first part. And the quote, as you have there, quote, "They believe that focusing on anything," practitioners believe, of this ilk, believe that focusing on anything, anything additional duties distracts, weakens the mission. Right? So you have a terrorist-focused practitioner. The next is an all hazards focus. And I'll discuss what this means in a second. CUS. The second is an all hazards focus. And with respect to an all hazards focus, terrorism, man-made disasters, and natural disasters, right? Terrorism, man-made disasters, and natural disasters constitutes generally, we can make this more complicated, constitutes an all hazards disaster, right? So obviously we'll say that we have terrorism, man-made disasters,